King Charles III has just detonated the most ferocious private eruption of his entire reign, unleashing a cold, calculated fury that has left Buckingham Palace's most seasoned courtiers ashen-faced and trembling behind closed mahogany doors. 4 minutes ago, in the pale amber glow of the king's private study at Clarence House, the 76-year-old monarch, the last living guardian of a promise sworn over a coffin draped in the royal standard nearly 3 decades ago, finally shattered his rigid, aristocratic composure and issued an order so devastating, so surgically precise, that it will echo through the corridors of the institution for generations. The trigger was a single encrypted message, delivered through a back channel that should never have existed, in which Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, had dared to present herself under a title so sacred, so fiercely protected, so drenched in the blood and tears of Princess Diana herself, that the palace had explicitly, formally, and irrevocably forbidden its use by any living woman. Charles read the wording twice. He placed the message face down on the mahogany table. And then, in a voice stripped of every ounce of paternal warmth, he demanded to know who had allowed it to reach the palace. What exactly did Diana whisper into her son's ear on that final August evening in Kensington Palace, only hours before boarding the plane to Paris? Why did the late Queen Elizabeth II explicitly forbid, in a handwritten codicil sealed with crimson wax, that this particular title ever again be borne by any woman who married into the House of Windsor? And what dark hidden tragedy, buried for 28 years beneath layers of institutional silence, forensic manipulation, and the ruthless machinery of the palace, has finally compelled the King of the United Kingdom to break the sacred vow he made at his mother's deathbed and expose the very apparatus that once destroyed the woman he loved? The private study at Clarence House sat suspended in an unnatural, suffocating stillness. It was just past 4 in the afternoon, the pale winter light bleeding through the tall Georgian windows in narrow, angled shafts, catching the dust motes that danced above the king's mahogany desk. Rain hammered relentlessly against the leaded glass, a low, ceaseless drumming that seemed to match the erratic rhythm of the monarch's breath. The scent of aged paper, beeswax polish, and the faint, bittersweet trace of Charles's Earl Grey, long gone cold, hung heavy in the air. Above the marble fireplace, the Van Dyck portrait of Charles I gazed down with those famously melancholy eyes, as though the doomed Stuart king himself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. On the desk lay the object that had, in the span of 4 minutes, transformed an already fragile royal dispute into the most personal, incendiary confrontation of Charles's reign. A cream-colored envelope, its edges slightly frayed, sealed with a plain wax disc bearing no crest, no coronet, no cipher, no insignia of any recognized royal household. Just a single, curling initial pressed into the crimson wax, an M. Charles sat perfectly motionless, his knuckles white against the arms of his leather chair, the tremor in his left hand, the tremor he had spent years disguising in public, now pronounced and visible. Beside him stood Sir Clive Alderton, his private secretary of 12 years, a man renowned across Whitehall for his glacial composure, now visibly sweating beneath the starched collar of his charcoal suit. A single bead traced its way down his temple. In his hand, he clutched a slim manila folder, its edges damp from the pressure of his fingers, containing the printed transcript of the encrypted message, and, beneath it, something far worse. The internal palace communications log showing exactly how the message had reached the king's private inbox, bypassing 3 separate layers of institutional filtering. For 28 years the world has spoken for her, Charles said finally, his voice growly, weighted, trembling at the edges like a violin string pulled too taut. For 28 years I have kept my silence. Today, Clive, today I speak for her. He raised his eyes and Alderton felt the breath leave his lungs. And I want to know, before this hour is out, who in this palace, who in my palace, allowed the name Princess of Wales to be born, in writing, in a formal request to the sovereign, by that woman? Somewhere in the depths of Buckingham Palace, in the communications wing that operated 24 hours a day beneath the state apartments, a technician was already frantically attempting to trace the routing signature of the encrypted feed. The satellite uplink had originated from Montecito, California, but had passed through 3 separate relay servers, one in London, one in Zurich, and one, most damningly, in the private secretariat of a senior courtier, whose name would, within the next 40 minutes, be scrubbed from the palace directory. The trap had been set, but it had not been set by Meghan. It had been set for her, and by someone standing far closer to the throne than anyone yet suspected. Alderton opened the folder with hands that would not stop trembling. He cleared his throat twice and began to read aloud the wording of the message. The request itself was, on its surface, almost banal. A formal petition to His Majesty for a private audience framed as a gesture of reconciliation. An olive branch extended in the wake of years of transatlantic acrimony. But it was the signature block that had detonated the king's fury. Beneath the printed name, in a curling, deliberate hand, Meghan had signed herself with the honorific that had not been used, formally or informally, by any woman since the death of Diana Frances Spencer on the 31st of August, 1997. Not Kate, not Camilla, not even in her final years Diana herself after the stripping of her HRH. And now, in a single stroke of ink, an American duchess in exile had reached across an ocean and claimed it. The king closed his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, he was no longer 76. He was 48, standing barefoot on the cool stone floor of a private chapel at Balmoral, in the small hours of the 1st of September 1997, staring at the black telephone that had just delivered the news that would ruin him. He remembered the smell of the beeswax candles. He remembered the sound of his own son, William, weeping in the next room. He remembered the promise he had whispered into the darkness, to a woman who was already gone, that he would protect the boys, that he would protect her memory, and that no other woman would ever again bear her title while he drew breath. He opened his eyes. "Bring me Sir Edward," he said quietly. Alderton froze. "Your Majesty, bring me Sir Edward." There are, within the labyrinthine hierarchy of the British royal household, certain figures who do not appear in the court circular, who do not attend garden parties, who do not stand behind the sovereign on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. They are the invisible architects of the institution. The men in charcoal suits and polished Oxford shoes, who carry clipboards not because they need them, but because the clipboards make them appear ordinary. They have served through 4 reigns. They have outlasted prime ministers, archbishops, and press secretaries. They speak in the passive voice. They author no memoirs. And when a crisis threatens the crown, it is they, and not the royals themselves, who decide what shall be done. Sir Edward Whitmore Coates, a name that appeared on no official register, whose office at Buckingham Palace bore no plaque, and whose position was described, when described at all, simply as senior advisor to the household, was the most dangerous of them. He had been a junior clerk in the private secretariat in 1995. He had been the man who drafted the memo advising that Diana's HRH be stripped upon divorce. He had been, according to a single line in a redacted MI6 file that Charles had seen only once in the autumn of 2002, of material interest to the inquiry into events in Paris, and he had 4 minutes ago become the man who had allowed Meghan Markle's message to reach the king's desk. The door opened without a knock. Sir Edward entered, 68 years old, silver-haired, his charcoal suit immaculate, his cold gray eyes betraying nothing. He carried, as always, a slim leather clipboard. He inclined his head with the precise degree of deference that protocol required. "No more, no less, Your Majesty." Charles did not rise. Charles did not offer him a seat. Charles simply pointed to the cream-colored envelope on the desk. "Explain." The room dropped into a silence, so absolute that Alderton could hear the ticking of the 18th-century long-case clock in the corner, each brass talk landing like a hammer blow. Sir Edward glanced at the envelope. His expression did not change. But, and Alderton would later swear to this, in a private conversation with the King's assistant private secretary, over 3 fingers of Highland Park whiskey at his club, a single muscle twitched at the corner of the courtier's jaw. It was the only tell, but it was enough. "The Duchess of Sussex," Sir Edward began, his voice smooth as glass, "has been in correspondence with the private office for some weeks, Your Majesty. The letter was received through appropriate channels. The signature block is, of course, a matter for Her Grace's own discretion." "Do not," Charles interrupted. And for the first time in a decade, Alderton heard the roar of the young Prince of Wales beneath the aged monarch's voice. "Insult me in my own study, Edward. That title is not hers to claim. That title has not been hers to claim from the moment she left this country in a rented private jet in 2020. And you know it. You, of all men, know it." Sir Edward said nothing. "My mother," Charles continued, and now his voice dropped to something colder, something more terrifying, "wrote a codicil, in her own hand, on the 22nd of October, 1997, 7 weeks after Diana's death. That codicil was sealed with the private cipher of the sovereign and lodged in the archive at Windsor. That codicil expressly prohibited, expressly, Edward, the use of the style Princess of Wales by any woman other than the reigning holder of the title, without the personal written, signed consent of the monarch. My mother's consent, and after her death mine." He paused. The rain against the window seemed to grow louder. "I did not give consent. Camilla did not use it. Catherine uses it only as her lawful title, and now..." He picked up the envelope. He held it between 2 fingers as though it were contaminated. "Now this woman, 3,000 miles from these shores, signs herself with it, and it reaches my desk. Through your office, through your hands." He looked up. "Explain." The flashback came unbidden, as flashbacks always do, triggered by the scent of beeswax and the sound of rain. It was the summer of 1996, Kensington Palace. Diana, 35 years old, barefoot on the Persian rug in her sitting room, her hair still damp from the pool at Highgrove, holding a glass of iced water and speaking to a 9-year-old William, who sat cross-legged on the floor, listening with the grave attention of a boy who understood far more than his years should have allowed. "Darling," she had said, her voice soft but urgent, "if ever anything happens to Mummy, if ever Mummy is not here, I want you to remember something. There is a title, my title, And when the time comes for you to give it to your own wife, you must give it freely and lovingly. And it must be hers alone. No one else can take it. No one else can claim it. Not while there is breath in the house of Spencer, do you understand? And William, with his gap-toothed seriousness, had nodded. And Diana had bent down and pressed her forehead to his and whispered something else. Something that only William in all the world knew. And outside the window, in the honeysuckle-scented dusk of a Kensington July, a single swallow had darted across the pale evening sky. William had never forgotten. And when he had married Catherine in April 2011, and she had, in due course, become Princess of Wales upon his father's accession, William had understood that his mother had, from beyond the grave, given her blessing. And he had understood, with equal clarity, that no other woman, not his brother's wife, not any woman, was ever to claim what Catherine now bore in his mother's honor. Charles knew all this. Charles had been in the next room that summer afternoon in 1996. Charles had heard, and now Meghan had signed her name. "Your Majesty," Sir Edward said at last, his voice betraying the first hairline crack, "I would respectfully suggest that this is a matter for the private office to resolve quietly." A note from the assistant private secretary, gently reminding the Duchess of the appropriate protocol. "No." The word landed like a dropped guillotine. "No," Charles repeated. "This will not be resolved quietly, Edward, because this is not a mistake. This is not a lapse of protocol. This is a deliberate, coordinated, calculated move, and you and I both know who authored the strategy, and it did not originate in Montecito." The courtier's face remained a mask. But the silence that followed was the silence of a man who has just realized that the trap he laid has become the trap in which he now stands. Somewhere in a control room in Broadcasting House, a duty producer was watching a rolling news alert flicker across his monitor. "Palace sources indicate communication from Duchess of Sussex." He picked up the phone. Within 9 minutes, the story would be on the wires. Within 20 million people would be watching live. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses would freeze mid-air. Across kitchens in Cardiff, mothers would call their husbands into the sitting room. Across Montecito, in a sunlit garden overlooking the Pacific, an American duchess would receive a phone call that she was not expecting. And across a private residence in Windsor Great Park, a 43-year-old prince, the elder son of Diana Frances Spencer, would set down the book he was reading and go very, very still. But that was still 9 minutes away. For now, in the study at Clarence House, Charles reached across his desk and pressed a small brass button beneath the lip of the drawer. There was a soft mechanical click and a panel in the side of the mahogany bookcase, a panel that Alderton, in 12 years of service, had never noticed, slid open, revealing a small compartment lined in green baize. Inside lay a slim, leather-bound folio, its cover embossed with the private cipher of Elizabeth II. Charles withdrew it with something approaching reverence. He set it on the desk beside Meghan's envelope. He laid his hand upon it. "This," he said, "is my mother's codicil. Signed, sealed, and witnessed by the Lord Chamberlain on the 22nd of October, 1997. Would you like to read it aloud, Edward, or shall I?" Sir Edward's throat worked. He said nothing. Charles opened the folio, and in a voice that had gathered, over the course of the past 20 minutes, the terrible authority of a monarch who has, at last, decided that he no longer fears the machinery of his own institution, he began to read. "Let it be known, and forever remembered, that the style and dignity of Princess of Wales, born with such grace and such suffering by our beloved daughter-in-law Diana, Princess of Wales, shall not be conferred upon, assumed by, or used by any woman married into the House of Windsor, save by our personal and written consent, and after our decease, by the personal and written consent of our successor. This is our wish, our command, and our final word upon the matter, in memory of a mother who was loved by a nation, and in protection of the 2 boys she left behind." Elizabeth R. The King closed the folio. The clock ticked, the rain fell. And Sir Edward Whitmore Coates, senior advisor to the household, architect of memos, drafter of strategies, invisible hand behind 4 decades of palace policy, understood, for the first time in his long, cold, calculated career, that he had been outmaneuvered by a dead queen. The interruption, when it came, was almost gentle. The antique brass telephone on the king's desk, the private line, the one whose number was known only to 5 living people, began to ring. Charles glanced at it. He knew, without lifting the receiver, who it was. He lifted it anyway. "William." There was a long pause. And then, in a voice stripped entirely of sovereign authority, of princely composure, of every layer of institutional armor that the future king had spent 40 years constructing, a voice that was, quite suddenly, the voice of a 15-year-old boy walking behind his mother's coffin down the Mall on a gray September morning in 1997, William spoke. "Papa, is it true?" Charles closed his eyes. "Yes, she used Mama's, yes." Another pause. Alderton, watching the king's face, saw a single tear track its way down the deep lines of the 76-year-old cheek. Charles did not wipe it away. "Papa," William said, and now his voice cracked entirely, "you made a promise, at Grandmama's bedside, in 2022. I was there, I heard you. You said that if this day ever came, you would honor it. I know, my boy. Then honor it." The line went dead. Charles set the receiver down with infinite care. For a long moment, he did not speak, and then he raised his eyes to Sir Edward, and the fury in them was no longer the hot fury of a father protecting his son's inheritance, nor the cold fury of a monarch defending his mother's decree. It was something older, something deeper. It was the fury of a man who had loved a woman 30 years ago, had failed to protect her from the machinery that eventually killed her, and had now been given, at long last, the opportunity to break that machinery apart. "Edward," he said quietly, "you were a junior clerk in 1995. You drafted the divorce memo in 96. You were, according to files I have read, in Paris on the 28th of August 1997, 3 days before my wife died in a tunnel. You have, for 28 years, sat in this palace, and you have engineered every single significant decision regarding the House of Windsor's relationship with the Spencer family. And now, in the twilight of my reign, you have arranged, through channels you thought I could not trace, for the woman my younger son married to signal, publicly, an intention to reclaim a title that would rupture forever what remains of the bond between my two boys." He rose. He walked around the desk. He stood at last, directly in front of the man who had, for a quarter of a century, been the invisible architect of the House of Windsor's cruelties. "Why, Edward?" Sir Edward's mouth opened and closed. "Why?" And in that silence, that long, damning, catastrophic silence, Charles understood. Meghan had not sought this. Meghan had been used. The wording of the letter, the specific title, the deliberate breach of protocol, the routing through Sir Edward's private secretariat, none of it had originated in Montecito. It had been suggested, encouraged, perhaps even drafted, by an advisor working through a back channel, by a man who understood that if Meghan could be manipulated into claiming Diana's title, it would provoke William into a permanent, public, irrevocable rupture with his brother. A rupture that would ensure the Sussex line was, forever, extinguished from the succession, and that the palace machinery could, at last, be free of the last thorn in its side. The men in grey had never wanted Meghan back. The men in grey had wanted her destroyed. And they had chosen the one weapon that would ensure William's rejection of her would be absolute, generational, and permanent. Charles saw it all, and Sir Edward saw that he saw it. "You used a grieving American woman," Charles whispered, "to try to finish what you began in Paris." The forensic proof was in the folio. Charles had known it would be. He turned to the second page of the codicil, a page that Alderton had never seen, that not even the Lord Chamberlain had known existed, and slid it across the desk. It bore in his mother's precise hand a list of names, 7 names. Senior courtiers whom Elizabeth had, in the autumn of 1997, personally identified as having acted against the interests of the late Princess of Wales and against the wishes of the sovereign in matters requiring further inquiry. Sir Edward's name was the 4th on the list. The king picked up the second telephone on his desk. He dialed a 3-digit internal extension. "This is His Majesty," he said. "Sir Edward Whitmore Coates is to be escorted from the palace immediately. His security clearances are revoked. His office is to be sealed pending investigation by the Metropolitan Police in coordination with the Home Secretary. He is not to be permitted contact with any member of the royal household, staff, or press. Effective now." He set the receiver down. Sir Edward did not move. Sir Edward, for the first time in his long life, seemed to have forgotten how. 2 officers in dark suits entered the study. They did not speak. They simply took Sir Edward by the elbows, gently but firmly, and led him from the room. He did not look back. And as the door closed behind him, Alderton, hardened, glacial, 12-year veteran Alderton, sank into the nearest chair and put his head in his hands. "Your Majesty," he whispered. "The press, let them come," Charles said. He walked to the window. He watched the rain fall on the courtyard below. He thought of Diana, barefoot on the Persian rug, whispering into William's ear. He thought of his mother, in her final weeks at Balmoral, gripping his hand with surprising strength and making him swear, upon his coronation oath and upon the memory of the woman they had both loved, that he would, when the moment came, do what she had never been permitted to do. He thought of William's cracked voice on the telephone. He thought of Harry, 3,000 miles away, who would, within the hour, learn that his wife had been used as a weapon against his own brother and against the memory of the mother he had lost when he was 12 years old. And Charles thought, perhaps for the first time in his reign, that he might at last be worthy of the crown. He turned from the window. He picked up Meghan's envelope. He walked to the fireplace, where a low fire burned in the grate. He held the envelope over the flames, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he set it down on the mantelpiece instead. "No," he said aloud, to no one in particular. "No, she deserves to know." He returned to the desk. He picked up the private telephone. He dialed the international code for California. The call was answered on the second ring. "Meghan," he said quietly. "This is your father-in-law. We need to speak. Alone. Immediately. And I need you to listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you. Because there are things you do not know about how this letter came to be written, and about the man who suggested you sign it as you did. Things about Diana, things about the palace, things that when you understand them, will change everything." There was a long silence on the line. And then in a small voice, the voice of a woman who had spent 5 years being told, by everyone she trusted, that the palace hated her, Meghan whispered, "I'm listening." Charles closed his eyes, and he began to speak. He spoke for 42 minutes. He told her about the codicil. He told her about the swallow and the whisper on the Persian rug and the promise made over a coffin. He told her about the 7 names on the list and the memo of 1996 and the file in the MI6 archive that mentioned Paris. He told her that she had been used, not by her husband, not by her mother-in-law's memory, but by an old man in a charcoal suit who had spent 28 years engineering the destruction of the Spencer line within the House of Windsor. And he told her, with a gentleness that surprised even him, that if she wished, if she truly wished, there was a way back, not to the title she had claimed. That title was, and would forever remain, Diana's, and after her, Catherine's, by the codicil of a queen who had understood, at last, what her son's first wife had suffered. But a way back to her family, to Harry's family, to the boys, Archie and Lilibet, who bore Spencer blood in their veins and who deserved to know their cousins and their uncle, and the grandmother whose portrait hung above the mantelpiece in Kensington Palace. Meghan wept. She wept for a long time. And then, in a voice thick with something that had once been grief and was now something else, something like clarity, she said, "I will do whatever you ask." "Your Majesty, Charles," he corrected her gently. "Just Charles, and I ask only this, come home, both of you quietly, without press, without conditions, and let us try, in the time that remains to me, to undo what the men in grey have done." She said yes. He set the receiver down. Alderton, still slumped in the chair by the fireplace, looked up. "Your Majesty, it is finished, Clive," Charles said. He looked at the codicil, he looked at Meghan's envelope, he looked at the portrait of Charles I above the fire, and he permitted himself, for the first time in 28 years, a single small private smile. "It is finished." But it was not, of course, quite finished, because within the hour the story had broken across every major network in Britain. The BBC led with it at 6. Sky ran it as a rolling banner. ITN interrupted regular programming. 20 million people watched. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses did indeed freeze mid-air. Across Cardiff and Belfast and Newcastle and London and every corner of the 4 nations, the British public, that vast, weary, ever-watchful public that had loved Diana, had mourned Diana, had never stopped grieving Diana, held its breath. Sir Edward Whitmore Coates was arrested at his flat in Belgravia at 7:14 that evening on charges that the Home Office declined at that stage to specify. Buckingham Palace issued a single-sentence statement at 8. His Majesty has today acted to enforce the wishes of the late Queen, as expressed in a codicil dated the 22 October 1997, regarding the title Princess of Wales. William was seen briefly at the door of Anmer Hall embracing his father in a long, silent, public reunion that ended 12 years of quiet coldness between them. Harry and Montecito boarded a private flight at 11 that night. Meghan sat beside him. They did not speak to the press. They did not need to. And in the private chapel at Windsor, at some hour deep in the night, when the palace had at last fallen silent, King Charles III knelt alone before the tomb of his mother, and he laid upon the marble the folio containing her codicil, and he whispered in a voice that no living soul heard, "It is done, Mama. I have kept the promise, and Diana can rest." The broadcast, when it cut to black, did so without music, without commentary, without ceremony. Just the image of Buckingham Palace under a cold, clear winter moon, the royal standard flying at full mast, and, for those who were watching very closely, a single swallow, improbable in December, impossible in the small hours of a London night, and yet unmistakably there, darting across the pale disk of the moon before vanishing into the dark. The swallow had finally flown free. The truth had at last saved her boys. And across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, in that first held breath after the screens went dark, 20 million people understood, without needing to be told, that something had ended and something had begun, and that the woman who had walked barefoot on a Persian rug in a Kensington summer nearly 30 years ago had, from beyond the grave, finally at long last been heard. The palace was silent. The rain had stopped. The secret was out.